Chuck Todd has spent decades covering politics. He is the former host of Meet the Press, the current host of the Chuck Todd Cast. Chuck, great to see you again. Nobody complained when the Sacramento Bee cut staff last year. Why do you think this is such a big deal to so many people?
Well, I think when you live in Washington, I look at it, I'm still trying to find out what's going on in the Washington Wizards front office that made him decide to go get Trae Young and Anthony Davis. And I'm really bummed that I don't have a local news organization that's working on that story. I have to go to The Athletic, and really, they're not covering it from a Washington perspective. So, but I want to actually sort of respond a little bit to I think the worst argument to make in criticizing Bezos here is to say you can absorb it. That's not the argument to make. I think the argument to make is he's making a bad business decision. And in fact, he's now doubling down. I say this as somebody who understands, who's worked in this Washington media market. And what's interesting to me, it's a lot of, what I think is the advantage the Post had over the rest of the Washington media ecosystem is that they had the vast resources, and they weren't just covering Capitol Hill and the administration. That's what Politico does. National Journal, Congressional Quarterly, Roll Call, Punch Bowl, right? That's a very crowded space. One thing I would do is, what's your differentiator? And suddenly the Washington Post did have a differentiator. They covered the community. They, in theory, used to cover Virginia, in all sorts of ways, Maryland in all sorts of ways, a district for people that live there. And I think, Rob, a lot of us in the political world look at this through the political lens and political coverage. I'm looking at this through, if you didn't want to do this, I wish you would have just sold it, because I think there are still ways to do what an old community newspaper did and not lose money.
Yeah,
but
so I know, Chuck, do you think it's a bad business decision, even though the paper is losing money?
I don't think that the argument, I don't think that's a good critique of Bezos. That, to me, it's, well, you made a bad business decision. Why are you doubling down? You're actually going to now lose more money over time.
Because the paper is losing money, right? So it's a good business decision to cut staff. They did it at the Boston Globe, too. A rich guy owns the Boston Globe, John Henry, and they cut staff, and nobody complained.
No. The reason it's losing money right now is because he made bad decisions in hiring the wrong publisher who had the wrong business mindset. The New York Times, whatever you think of them ideologically, take that away. They figured out how to take advantage of the moment they got, right? Just like Newsmax is having a good moment. You guys are taking what you're earning, and then you're reinvesting it and trying to create a more solid floor. That's what the New York Times did. Like I said, that's what Mr. Ruddy is doing with Newsmax. That is not what Mr. Bezos did with the Washington Post. I just would argue he's just been a bad steward on the business side. I don't want to even get into the political side here.
The political side is a big side of it,
I think that's where the argument falls apart.
But the political side is a big side of it. Just the sort of way that the Washington Post covers stories and the way that the New York Times covers stories. I think if you're on the right, you might say that the Washington Post is not totally fair to conservatives in Washington, Republicans on Capitol Hill, certainly not the Trump administration. Let me just ask this, because I want to move on. Do you think the reaction would be the same from the media if the New York Post or like the Wall Street Journal cut a third of their staff? Do you think people on the left in journalism would care? I don't think they would. By the way,
well, when the Wall Street Journal went through its first cuts, there was you did see a lot of noise.
But this kind of outcry, Peter Baker tweeting that because Jeff Bezos has got a lot of money, he should waste a lot of money.
Like, it's our hometown paper. I've lived here 35 years, right?
Yeah.
And I ache for the Miami Herald. What it was, that was the original hometown paper I grew up with. It was the state newspaper of the state of Florida. It wasn't just Miami's newspaper.
I do agree with you there, Chuck. I do agree. In the sports section thing, look, John Henry, another rich guy, came in, bought the Boston Red Sox, bought the Boston Globe. His wife, no experience in working in newspapers, runs the Globe. They gutted the best sports department in journalism. It was murderers row, the people that used to write for the Globe.
And let me tell you one other thing,
Rob. It broke
Rob.
my heart. Okay.
It was a bad business decision, because guess what's making money in Massachusetts? You know who is? It's a company called Mass Live of Advanced Media. And you know how they did it? They have the biggest sports department now in the state of Massachusetts. They are bigger than the globe. Sports is actually the best way to build a news business.
We're not going to disagree there. We are not going to disagree there. I want to ask you about what we've learned over the last few weeks when it comes to the Epstein files. All these Democrats in Washington and Republicans, this has been bipartisan, pushing for the release of this information. We've learned a whole lot about Bill Gates, if it is true, again, allegedly. We've learned a lot about Bill Clinton. Do you think this story, the Jeffrey Epstein story, is still a Donald Trump story?
No, I think this is look, I think we are on the verge of, where the left and the right agree. It's on questioning the elites and the ultra rich and what is their motivation? Are they looking out, right? I put this in that category, that this is, hey, they don't even play by the same set of rules that I have to play by. Right. And you're seeing that. I think that is what really makes this. Look, I think there's a chunk of Epstein consumers that are about the conspiracy theories and are in deeper. Right. There's that. But there's this other chunk, because, you get a lot of questions about it. I'm sure I do, friends and family. And it's this ick. Right. It's the ick factor. It's who are these guys?
Well,
they really think they can do whatever the hell they want.
Look,
and they can do whatever the hell they
it.
want to my pension and whatever the hell they want to little girls and whatever the hell they want. What is going on here? I think that's where I think it has a deeper political. So look, I still think there's, I would be careful on either side of the aisle trying to use it on one side or the other. I think this is more of a elites versus non-elite story, not necessarily any more left versus right.
And can I add to that? Also maybe exposing some of these people for who they really are. If these accusations around Bill Gates are true, not only is that disgusting, but how revealing for somebody that people used to invite on and celebrate in the media.
Of course.
And then Bill Clinton had Jeffrey Epstein to the White House 17 times over a 3-year period that we know about. What were they talking about? What were they doing? Did he know about Monica Lewinsky? These are all fair questions. Final thought. I've only got 15 seconds, Chuck.
Right. It all goes back to, if you have enough money, you can get away with anything.
Yeah. Chuck Todd, I appreciate you coming on as always. Seriously, I really appreciate you coming on.
No, Rob, I enjoy because you treat me with a ton of respect. I appreciate it. As you know, as much as people like to put me in a box, I'm very uncomfortable being put in a box, and you appreciate that. So
well, we agreed quite a bit today. Chuck Todd, thank you.
Information. Truth is freedom. Is Newsmax. It's real news for real people.